Hey everyone, Somber here. We've just released a new version of the Somber Warhammer mod for Dominions 5. The big headline is that I've added the faction Nurgle, one of the four Chaos Ruinous powers. So there's only Tzeentch left to do, and I'll get to that at some point, I guess. But there's a bunch of changes to other nations as well, so I'm going to go through those. Just go through the changelog. People have said they appreciate these videos, so let's do that now. We're on version 2.51 because I had to do a hotfix because Khorne was crashing the game, which is very thematic. But version 2.5 is where most of the changes are. So let's just go through the changelog quick. So, first, in general, I have made a fix to some generic sites like Is Temple Nahazfort that I was using to power various event logic that the game needed to use, and I'd set those to be Holy 4 because I thought that's the highest level that you could set a site to, but now I've set them to Holy 9, so they won't get found by like you know prophetized Holy 3 people searching and so on. They'll still be picked up by it's not a Akashic record. What's the spell called? Anyway, the one that searches every path at level 9 would still do it. But I've also put in some events so that if you do discover them, they're just hidden away by another event straight away. And the same thing with Chaos Dwarf and Dark Elf sites. So hopefully I will not get people going, what is this site? all the time, because I got a lot of bug reports about that. I made some changes to rename various graphic files because there are certain server robots, like the Clockwork server robot, was occasionally overwriting files so that people would get the flags turning out to look the same. This wasn't a problem in the mod itself, it was just that the bots couldn't handle the files having the same name in different places in the mod's directory structure. But I've fixed that because it's something I could fix. Every instance of a shield, this is a weird bug that Loggy discovered, which is that sometimes the protection of units was messed up if the shield was declared before the armor, so they should always be declared after the armor. So I went through the entire mod file and fixed that for everything to avoid this rare protection bug. It took ages and it was very boring, but it's done now. And in the future, I've got a reminder for myself: always declare shields last for every monster. The giant stomp weapon used by giants in various nations is now defense negate as well as size resist. It was previously just size resist. I've done this basically because it was weird that if a big giant's just trying to tread on you with his big clumsy foot and you're really like defensively skilled, you should be able to dodge out of the way of it. That's how like the tail attacks work on dragons, for instance. Yeah, so I've basically made that. So that actually makes the giant stomp weapon a little bit worse. Tree men and giant things do that, but I've put in some other things that make giants slightly better, including this. So wild swings and heavy chain attacks used by giants in various nations had their damage reduced a bit, mainly to make them less lethal to the giant itself, so the giant shouldn't kill itself quite as often with its own attacks. They still will sometimes, which is intentional. And some troops got the skirmisher tag because the skirmisher tag is a thing in the game. It's not very important. It basically lets you have the loose formation without taking a morale bonus, but it is thematic to put it on some stuff, so I just stuck it in there. So let's go into the nation level tweaks, fixes, and any new content. So Beastmen, the chariot and Beast Lord and chariot resource costs were increased. They were a little bit too low given that they do have to build a chariot. They're still not super high, but they're just a little bit more expensive. And the Minotaur gold cost was increased from 65 gold to 70 gold, and it had its resource cost increased a bit because I was finding that the Minotaur troops were too attractive over every other troop option. There may be some more tweaks needed, but this is a general point. If one of the nations has a troop where people are just like, oh, that's clearly the best, it's better than everything else, I'll just build that. That's not ideal. I don't want that to be the case, so I'll usually make that troop a bit worse to encourage people to make some more variety of troops. The ideal is that you make the right troops for your own scales, depending on what enemies you're dealing with and so on. Some troops are good for expansion, some are good in the first war, some are good later in the game, some are good if you have lots of production, some are good if you have access to lots of resources or recruitment points, or you just need to spend tons of gold. But you should have options, that's the idea. For Bretonnia, Lords and Paladins will no longer take the questing vow in the first few turns of the game. Some people were having an issue where this is quite rare, but it was happening. Their like starting army, they were trying to lead it around with their lord, and then he suddenly took the questing vow and was like, "I'm not leading you anymore," and that kind of fouled up their expansion. So yeah, I'm basically it doesn't really matter to me, and people complained about it, so I just fixed it to make them happy. The spawn rate of pilgrims at temples was very slightly decreased. Basically, a big Bretonnia with a lot of temples was producing just too many pilgrims in total, so just toned that down a bit. For the Chaos Dwarfs, as a summary, Sacreds have been made a bit less cost effective and Slave Giants are a bit better. To go into the individual changes, Slave Giant gold cost was reduced from 220 to 200, just to make them a bit more attractive. The Slave Giant now has a single chain strike attack, which is an addition to stomping and whipping their chains around doing area of effect attacks. I think that it's good for things that have those big area effect attacks to also have like a single target whack, which they do now have. So they can occasionally just obliterate something they managed to hit with a big single attack too. Hobgoblin Wolf Rider defenses were increased by 1. This is a change I've made to a few different light cavalry units. Basically, if I think a light cavalry is not particularly good and people aren't using it, and it's known for being really agile and like skirmishing around and like riding circles around the enemy, I'll just give it a bit more defense to represent that. So light cavalry in Dominions is generally quite bad, but maybe Hobgoblin Wolf Riders are a little bit better now. Bull Centaurs had their gold cost increased from 55 to 65. This is a pretty significant increase. Basically, Bull Centaurs were a really strong sacred. They were really being used a lot, and people were taking pretty heavy blesses on them. And they're just a bit much. They were basically kind of around as good as like Pangaia's White Centaurs and Asphodel's Black Centaurs, and those are extremely strong sacreds. And yeah, I don't want Chaos Dwarves to have that. And I'm generally trying to make sacreds a little bit less good kind of across the whole mod, because I find if people take a really big bless, if sacreds are really good and people take a really big bless, then they're so focused on just making the sacreds. Again, they don't use the different troop options very much. They're just making sacreds, which is kind of boring. And there's a similar thing with the Bull Centaur Ancient. Both of them had their map move decreased a little bit to make them more like regular centaurs. They're slower footed, but they are better at marching, because dwarves are very good at marching and very disciplined, so they've got the same map move as regular centaurs. And then the Acolyte of Hashut, their other sacred, the ammo was decreased from 10 to 8 because they were being able to fire for too long during a battle, and after 8 I want them to stop doing it, and there's a little bit less damage. The Acolyte of Hashut is itself also quite a strong sacred. So yeah, that's just toned down a little bit. And the armor was changing from a quality scale mail Habak to a quality scale mail Cuirass, which is just a slight nerf, and to make them more in line as their status as a ranged troops. They're less capable as infantry now. They're still okay as infantry, but they're a little bit less tough. Military commanders got their shields upgraded to quality shields. This is an aesthetic thing. Obviously, they would have better quality shields. Dwarves can make those better shields, but the Chaos Dwarf troops in general don't use them. Shartor, which is the Bull Centaur Ancient hero, is very scary. He now can't spawn in the first 10 turns of the game. In general, if anyone spots any heroes or multi-heroes that are spawning too early and having a warping effect by, like, on turn 2, you get this absolute monster who just takes a province every turn. I don't want that to happen, so I'm making them so they can't turn up early in the game, and he's one of those. The Bull Centaur Ancient got a slight gold increase. It's the same thing. I'm making the sacred slightly worse. But they are now possible multi-heroes, though they can't appear in the first 4 turns of the game, and I could extend that if people are getting them and it's causing a huge problem on like turn 5 or 6. So I can take a further look at that. But overall, bit of a nerf to Chaos Dwarfs. Their giants are slightly better though. For the Dark Elves, the Dread Spear and Bleak Sword switched their shields for Light Kite shields. The Light Kite shield is a new thing I've introduced for the Elves that have got those big teardrop shields, because they're kind of lightweight, but they're also these big shields. But I didn't want to give them kite shields, which are like big metal shields in Dominions. So yeah, the Dark Elves and High Elves both have those, and hopefully it will make their infantry a bit more useful. They're just kind of basic infantry has those. Dark Elf Heavy Cavalry and Anointed of Slaanesh upgraded their shields to kite shields. So in general, I've been looking at the shields of the Elves and going, some of these need to be buffed up a bit. And so the Dark Elf Heavy Cavalry are getting these better shields, which is the same as basically all similar things in Dominions, Knights and stuff like that. The Dread Knight Gold Cross was increased a little bit, and its natural protection was lowered by 1. The Dread Knight was proving to be a little bit too good and too hard to kill, so that's just a slight nerf, and they've now got the kite shield, so it's kind of making up for that bit. The Cold One Knight got a bit of a gold increase. They were very favoured for expansion by a lot of people, so this is just to make them slightly less attractive. Knight Assassins got their gold cost increased because they were very reliable against certain nations. Basically, if something's going to be really reliable and good, I want it to be at least a significant gold investment, so that if the opponent does develop a counter against it, they are actually punishing the nation that's using it, or you're having to take some kind of opportunity cost in order to use something that's really good. And the Knight Assassin was a little bit too reliable, basically. Death Hag and Crone Hellebron now give poor undead leadership. This was a problem when the Death Hag and Crone Hellebron have magic outside of combat, and then inside combat they lose their magic. But that meant that people would sometimes give them demons to lead. They would go into combat, they'd lose their leadership, and then the demons would just run away, which is really weird. So that's actually more of a fix than a tweak, but yeah, that's been dealt with. The Hell Scourge, which is on the Slaaneshi Hellstrider unit that the Dark Elves also has access to, its damage is reduced by 2. This is a nerf to the Hellstriders against higher protection targets. It's still an armor-piercing weapon, I believe, and it's still a really good weapon, and Hellstriders might still be too good. Who knows? I'm going to have to keep an eye on them because they're a unit with a lot of really strong stuff. They've got life drain, they've got magic weapons, they've got long weapons, length 5 because of their whips. So yeah, they've got a lot going for them, and they're, demonic cavalry. This is one that people have been reporting quite a bit, and some people have been getting quite annoyed, is that the Cult of Pleasure was blowing up their temples too much, and they were finding it too difficult to stop the Cult of Pleasure from just taking over their nation. And I didn't want it to be so onerous, so now your chances to remove or downgrade the Cult of Pleasure sites based on Dominion have been increased. But more importantly, Cult of Pleasure sites can no longer appear or upgrade if the province has more than 6 friendly Dominion candles. So if you really want the Cult of Pleasure to never get into I don't know if it's more than 6 or 6 or more. I think it might be 6 or more actually. But if you really don't want the Cult of Pleasure to turn up, get your Dominion high in a province, and then the Cult of Pleasure just cannot go there and cannot upgrade anymore. So you can at least safeguard some places. But this should also help the fact that you can remove or downgrade them more easily. So again, the answer to the Cult of Pleasure is Dominion strength, but this should make it a bit more reliable to get rid of the Cult of Pleasure. Onto the Dwarves, couple of fixes. So some people were having all of these sites keep turning up, the Lost Grumrill reserves and Lost Gold reserves and things like that, even though they had already fully upgraded their capital site. So this has now been fixed. And once the capital site is fully upgraded, any lost sites that are additional that are still out there will be they'll disappear. The Dwarves will basically just blow them up and collapse them because they've already fully upgraded their capital site. Then we've also got a tweak here. The Dwarfs, this is basically due to a typo on my part. The Dwarfs' fort province defense was crazy good, over 20 points. It was far too strong, so people were just dumping, they were dumping in going up to 35, 40 points in their capital when people were getting near them, and it was just too hard for people to deal with. So that has been significantly reduced. It's basically been halved, the additional stuff over 20 points. Greenskins, couple of fixes. The Wyvern second shape now has the correct slots. It previously could keep carrying magic weapons and things after its rider had died, which is weird. And Black Orcs now have correct upkeep. Their upkeep was just slightly off. The Night Goblin Great Shaman, so this is for Black Crag, his gold cost was increased slightly and he generates a temporary nature gem per battle. This is just to make it a little bit more interesting to recruit and use for various things, and represents that they've got a supply of madcap mushrooms that they're jumping on, and that's that one temporary gem. The Boar Chariot's resource cost was slightly increased. The Boar Chariot was basically just a little bit too low resource cost for what it was. Orc Biggin gold cost was increased a bit because people were almost exclusively taking Biggins over Orc Boys, and I'd like them to use Orc Boys as well. And also when I was comparing them with Banda Warriors and things like that from the base game, they were a little bit too cheap. The regular boy is still very discounted and very cheap. Same thing with Savage Orc Biggins. Bit more expensive. Orc Arab Boys recruitment point cost was reduced a bit so that you can mass them a little bit. They're still not a great option, but you can actually have some of them now, mass them more easily. Orc Boar Boys gold cost was just changed from 26 to 25. That's just an aesthetic thing. 26 just, well, it can be 25. 26 just looks weird. Dominions usually goes up in stages of 5. The Savage Orc Boar Boys gold cost was reduced from 28 to 25. So this is actually a nice kind of gold cost buff to them. The number of rec points were increased slightly, making them slightly harder to mass, but also their strength was reduced slightly. So they're very similar to the Orc Boar Boy, but there still is a kind of a choice between those two things. One of them has more protection, they have different weapons and so on. One of them costs fewer resources. The Boar Boy Biggin gold cost was reduced from 36 to 35. That's another aesthetic change. Giants gold cost was reduced from 200 to 180. This is to make Giants a bit more attractive. We'll have to just keep an eye on Giants and see if I can get them in that sweet spot where they're not too cheap that you always just bring Giants, because they are they can just obliterate things and they do have fear and they do have tons of hit points. So if you get some buffs on them, they can be really strong. But currently they're just too expensive for what they actually are able to do. Goblin Wolf Rider defense +1, representing mount agility. Again, Goblin Wolf Riders were not a very popular thing to make, and this just improved them as light cavalry. Giants now have that additional club attack that I mentioned earlier, the single target club attack they can just smash things with. Someone pointed out that Wurzag is able to predict the future, possibly in a deranged orky way, but he now has Fortune Teller 10, representing that he can predict the future. Well, he has prophecies that he predicts at least. Snagler Grobsbit, which is another hero for Bone Nose, had his natural protection lowered and his invulnerability increased a little bit, so the invulnerability actually does something. I made a comment that somebody was laughing at, which I was saying on some units the invulnerability is decorative, because the invulnerability represents their magical tattoos that protect them, but some units already have high natural protection, and so the invulnerability doesn't do anything, it only replaces natural protection if it's higher. So I'm trying to make it so that when I'm able to, the invulnerability actually does something, but sometimes it is just going to be decorative because they've got tattoos, they have invulnerability, it just doesn't do anything because they've got high protection. Moving on to the High Elves, we've got Illyrian Cavalry defense increased. This is another one of these light cavalry improvement ones. And then they've got some other improvements to their cavalry in that the shields on their heavy cavalry and their nobles, the stuff with heavy armor, get their shields are upgraded to kite shields, which is a bit of a buff and consistent with other things in Dominions like knights. Lothan, Seaguard, and Spearmen now have the light kite shield. This is the same as the Dark Elf change. The White Lion cloak protection was reduced by 1 further, and it's now only 1 more than a Great Hide shield. Basically, people were saying that the White Lion infantry were the main thing that they would ever build, which is not supposed to be the case. And I think that they were just a little bit too good against everything because they got a 2-handed axe and they're pretty skilled, and they also have a shield to protect them from missile attacks, and they also have pretty good defense. So in close combat, you often are hitting through the shield and the armor, so they have high protection as well. So I'm just making another little tweak to them, but maybe they're going to need further tweaks. The Lion Chariot's gold cost was increased from 90 to 100, a slight cost hike because they're a bit too attractive. They do have half upkeep, so I have to consider that when I'm looking at the gold costs. Are always going to be a bit inflated on High Elves because of that halved upkeep. The Swordmaster of Hoeth gold cost was reduced from 35 to 30 because they're a cap-only troop. They're competing with a bunch of other stuff for High Elves, and they were just kind of underperforming. I tried them in a bunch of tests against other infantry of similar prices, and they were just kind of sucking it up a bit. They're basically good on paper, but they perform badly. The Swordmaster of Hoeth also gets the same magic armor as Phoenix Guard, and I've renamed that armor to Ithelmar Scale Mail, so they have very slightly better armor as well. It's the same as the Phoenix Guard had. In the lore, it's not really clear who has Ithelmar. It's a rare and expensive material. Its properties are very suspicious because it's magical, stronger than steel, and lighter than silk, it's described as, which is very strange. But yeah, they've got better armor now. And it is magic, which is nice. The high-ranking military commanders also get the Ithelmar Scale Mail, so the High Elves have, in theory, got some kind of fugging that they could do with the high-ranking military commanders. Probably not going to because they're low hit points, but it's an option. Dragon Prince and Prince of Caledor combat speed was reduced a little bit just to make them slightly slower than Silver Helms, to make Silver Helms have more of a niche compared with those. And Fire and Earth were removed from the Smith of All random. Somebody pointed out that getting those randoms really sucks because it feels like you're missing out on the other randoms, and the Fire and Earth doesn't help you. That's supposed to say Fire or Earth. I've missaid Air there, but this is just makes them slightly. Technically, this makes them worse overall, but hopefully it makes them less disappointing when people recruit them and get that random. I think. Oh no, it doesn't make them worse because Fire and Earth in that random was making the chance of the other things worse. So yeah, hopefully just less disappointment for players. So for Khorne, anything in Chaos Plate or Chaos Plate Kuras had an increased resource cost. So this mostly matters for Chaos Warriors and Chaos Knights. You may now want to take production a bit more with Khorne. Chaos Ogre Gutplate also had its resource cost increased slightly, so that's for the Chaos Ogres. Speaker of Brass now turns up as a multi-hero option because he's their top tier mage. It's not very exciting multi-hero, but he is an option. And Chaos Warrior recruitment is now randomized between I've said the types, the 2 types. This is mainly because the 2-handed variant was too often a clear better choice, and that is also true for Nurgle, and it is also true for Slaanesh. When you recruit Chaos Warriors, you now just get one of the 2 types at random. It's like the Marauders. I found it difficult to balance the 1-handed weapon and shield ones versus the 2-handed weapon ones because the 2-handed weapons were much better. So now it's just random. So you just have to live with it. For Lizardman, Tic-Tac-Toe's air shield was reduced. There was some weird stacking going on that had made that shoot up super high, so I fixed that. And I added some bracketed text to indicate the number of additional bodyguards that could be assigned to Slann, because there isn't an icon for that. But Slann can have extra bodyguards, and that's particularly unusual, so I've put in some text to indicate that. For Nagashazar, the Corpse Giant gold cost was reduced to make them a bit more attractive. They have the additional club attack, which we talked about before. And then Fort Province Defense now uses randomized troops and is a bit better. Gives you more Long Dead Warriors, Long Dead Archers, and so on. The Cairn Wraith got a little bit of a nerf in that its gold cost was increased from 60 to 65 and it had a map move decrease. And the Tortured Spirit was improved. That was something that no one was ever making because they were comparing them with Cairn Wraiths and going, why would I have the Tortured Spirit? So it's gone from 30 gold to 25 because it was such an unattractive option. I have heard people say that the Cairn Wraith and Hex Wraith are still too good too early in the game, and I will keep an eye on that and maybe make some further changes to them, but they've got a little bit of a nerf on Cairn Wraiths at the moment. For Norska, the Ogre gold cost was increased from 35 to 40. The Ogres previously a bit too attractive compared with the human troops, and Norskan Ogres in particular were like, given that Norska is not really supposed to be as good as the other Chaos Nations, their particular Ogre was just a bit too good because of his two-handed weapon. And then Norskan Chosen had their gold cost increased from 45 to 50. Again, at 45 gold cost, they were basically better than the Chosen, especially for the gold. They were better than the Chosen of the other Chaos factions, particularly of Slaanesh. And so I've just increased their gold cost a bit to make that less of a thing. For Nurgle, the thing I've changed is to add the entire nation. It's completely new. Go and check out Nurgle. I hope you enjoy it. It's presumably, because it's new, is going to require some more balance tweaks and things, particularly the plague mechanics, but I'll probably do a video on that. But check out Nurgle and let me know what you think of it. For the Ogre Kingdoms, Mournfang Cavalry got a little bit of a buff in that they gained Woundfend 1. Woundfend 1 means that you take afflictions half as often. The Long Chopper that used by Mournfang Cavalry now has an attack bonus of 1. Mournfang Cavalry weren't very exciting previously. I'm just giving them a slight boost, basically. Pit Fighters' natural protection was lowered by 1. So Pit Fighters are interesting because if you compare them with some other Sacreds, they don't look on paper to be that great, but I was finding that in games people were fielding Pit Fighters with Blood Bonds, the damage getting distributed, and regeneration, and making use of their high hit points and their very high natural protection, and they were basically almost impossible to kill for some nations. They were just, it was a bit too much. So I just reduced their natural protection very slightly. Some more changes may happen with Pit Fighters, I'm not sure, but for the now, this is just, I think they're okay. I think they're in an okay place. Death Belcher's melee attack damage was increased a bit because they should be able to be okay in melee. They're still not good, but that makes them slightly better. And then their ranged weapon damage was increased a little bit. 11 to 12. It is still 12 armor piercing, and there's lots of shots, obviously. So yeah, they're just a bit more devastating than they were, and hopefully that makes them a bit more interesting and attractive. Slave Giants were buffed up, as we've talked about before. Iron Gut plate armor resource cost was increased slightly, just more in line with other Dominions things. And Gorger recruitment per turn was increased from 1 to 2, and they're now blind fighters, which can sometimes be helpful, but basically it's just so you can use Gorger sometimes a bit more. Only having 1 a turn was not enough given they're undisciplined. Slaanesh, I've added brackets to text to highlight the gender of seducers because some people were saying, I guess I hadn't made this clear enough, but basically some people were going, why do I have 2 of the same unit? Well, it's because they seduce different genders, but now it's become more clear and some extra text to tell people. Anything in Chaos Split or Chaos Split Chaos has increased resource cost, which is still discounted for Slaanesh. Slaanesh get a special discount to their resources on a lot of their units because they basically, there's supposed to be the temptation to take Sloth. This is how I designed Slaanesh, is that it's tempting to take Sloth, but maybe not a good idea, which is a kind of thematic thing if you think about it. Slaanesh is tempting you to do something that's maybe not a good idea. Anyway, we'll see how that works out, but it's a bit harder to mass Chaos Warriors and things now with Slaanesh. Little sip of drink. Chaos Ogre Gut Plate, resource cost increased by 1, similar to the others. The Marauder Horseman with Flail has now switched his full helm for a half helm, and he got +1 natural protection for their very scarred bodies, so a little bit of a buff to Flail Horseman. The Hellstriders I've mentioned before, and I think they might still be too good, but their damage has been reduced by 2 on their Hellscourge whips, so Hopefully they're a little bit less dominant. They were basically too obvious a choice over other things previously. Chaos Warrior recruitment is now randomized, we've talked about that, and the Sorcerer and Sorcerer Lord had their hit points reduced a bit from 13 and 15 respectively. It's important in the late game when there's remote attacks flying around and battlefield wired things hitting all the units, and it was just a bit too strong previously. For Skaven, the discovery of Warpstone Seam now requires a minimum of 1 province defense. This is to stop the Warpstone Seam discovery thing happening during fort siege situations, so it's just a fix. And Storm Vermin, this is the only real tweak to this game. Basically, I reduced the strength of Storm Vermin, and there's 2 reasons for this. One is that in more recent editions of Warhammer Fantasy Battle, I hadn't realised this, Storm Vermin used to be Strength 4 in their profile for Warhammer Fantasy Battle, and then they moved them to Strength 3, and that's a very specific thing they chose to do. Now, we have more granularity to what strength we can give things in Dominions, and they are still stronger than other Skaven. 10 is stronger than most Skaven. But the other reason for this is that Storm Vermin I found was slightly overperforming for their cost. I think that the Glaive, while it has bad stats in terms of attack and defense, its ability to hit very hard was very important to this game, and the Storm Vermin being slightly less good at hitting very hard means that you're less likely to find people just having Storm Vermin to make up the mass of their armies. They should now be using Clan Rats a bit more, maybe. So yeah, just a slight nerf to Storm Vermin, not a big difference though. For Talia, Oglakarna's Wolf Boys got the light cavalry buff that some other people have had, and the Giants of Albion got the giant buff that some others have had for consistency reasons. Getting near to the end now, we've got Vampires, so quick summary of this. Vampire commanders in general are very slightly nerfed. Blood Dragon was nerfed a bit more than very slightly, but still not very much. Province Defense improved, Cairnwraiths slightly nerfed, Corpse Giants and Tortured Spirits improved. So we've talked about the Giants, Tortured Spirits and Cairnwraiths. It's the same things we've talked about before, so let's talk about the other ones. Quick fix, ghouls of all types now have non-magical claw weapons. This was basically just a typo. I picked the wrong weapon. So they've got the same thing, but it's not magical. We've talked about Corpse Giants. Fort Province Defense now uses Long Dead and Soulless Montags as randomized troops, and it's a bit more Soulless focused, but it's overall better. Their Fort Defense was still a bit too bad before. The Charnel Sword, which is used by the Blood Dragon and Blood Drake vampires, had its defense bonus reduced from 2 to 1. Basically, I'm trying to get this supernaturally high defense down a little bit on the Blood Dragon and the Blood Drake, so that if you have units that can hit hard to get through their very high protection and vulnerability, you can at least have a little bit more of a chance of hitting them. These are pretty weak nerfs, and it could be that I think Vampires is historically the one that's had the most balance issues, and it could be that these balance issues are ongoing. If you feel like things are not right in terms of balance, particularly for the vampires, let me know. I will keep taking a look at it, but my plan is basically to make small adjustments as we go along till we get to a good place. The Vampire Bat Scout had his gold cost increased from 20 to 25. They were really good, Vampire Bat Scouts. You can have them everywhere. They're really useful. Flying Scouts. This is just to cost the vampires a bit more money and just an overall slight nerf to the nation. All vampires of all types across the board have their encumbrance increased from 0 to 1. This isn't actually much of a nerf, but it does mean that they now can tire over the course of combat. Having 0 encumbrance is like a special case where you just don't tire at all from wearing armor and things like that. So having their encumbrance increased to 1 means they have to watch out for that. Mounted units still do have some... they don't have very much encumbrance because they don't feel the encumbrance fatigue from the armor. But they can at least be tired out in theory. And I may look at that a bit more and maybe put some more in. I'm kind of diverging from what Dominions thinks vampires are, which is completely tireless, to them acting more like demons. Demons just have low encumbrance. Multi-heroes now can't appear in the first turns. People were getting some of the multi-heroes too early on and it was way too strong, so I've just made it so none of them could appear in the first 10 turns. Blood Dragon hit point was reduced from 42 to 38. Basically, Blood Dragons were able to do too much on their own. They may still be too strong. Sorry, my headset went out for a moment there, but I am back. I was just saying, Blood Dragons, this is another nerf to them. Basically, Blood Dragons are able to do too much on their own, given that they can fly all over the place and so on. So they may still need further nerfs, but there's another nerf to them. Cairnwraith nerfs, Tortured Spirit buff, we've talked about previously. And then finally, we have the Wood Elves. So firstly, a fix. The Waywatcher Longbow now does the same damage when in or outside a forest. It was at +1 damage in forest, and that was not intentional. And then the Glade Rider Cavalry got the defense buff that lots of light cavalry get. Not all light cavalry get this, but the Glade Rider was not being used very much, so it gets the cavalry defense increase. The Waywatcher longbow, it's had its damage decreased from 8 to 7. They are half strength, so you can add strength onto them relatively easily, and they do have armor piercing, so they still do tons of damage, it's just reduced a bit. And the Waywatcher is being used a little bit too much over everything else. Treemen now can't appear as multi-heroes before turn 10 because they were a bit disruptive, turning up as heroes too early on and being too good for expansion. Their Vine Lash length has been decreased by 1, and the number of attacks has been increased to 3, but instead of getting 2 Vine Lashes, each of 2 attacks, they now get a single one with 3 attacks, which is making them overall worse at repelling, and they have a little bit less offensive output naturally. This is partly just because Treemen were a little bit too useful in kind of expansion and early wars and things with a decent bless. So just a slight nerf to Treemen, but it's not too serious. Treemen Ancients gold cost was increased from 450 to 470. They're very powerful. You don't have a very large number of them, but they really are super strong, so I just increased their gold cost a bit. The Azrai longbow damage was increased a little bit over the regular longbow. Basically just got +1 damage. The Azrai longbow is supposed to be the main bow used by the Wood Elves, and it's like a special feature of their nation, so I wanted it to be strong. Particularly compared with like the Waywatcher's armor piercing bow, so hopefully the Azrai longbow is a little bit more attractive now. And then finally, Dryads in their winter form had their strength reduced by 1. The winter form wasn't intended to be one of their like most absolutely strong forms, and magic weapons is something they already have, so just making them slightly less good. So that is everything for the changelog. Yeah, thanks for watching the video. I hope you enjoy the mod. Let me know any feedback that you have. I will put a link to my Ko-Fi in the description of the video. Ko-Fi is a place where you can tip me some actual cash money if you want to. Do not feel obliged at all. I make the mods for fun and for free. I would make them regardless, but some people have expressed an interest in giving me a tip for the work I've been doing, so if you want to do that, you will find the link in the description. That's everything for today, so take it easy and see you around.